webinar session about software taxation in Brazil. This webinar was organized especially for the Canadian companies interested to export software to this market. Thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in the subject and hope it can bring some useful information for you and your company. I hope you are all well and safe on these COVID times. My name is Claudia Kakunaka, and I am the ICT Trade Commissioner based in São Paulo, Brazil, and I will be hosting this webinar today. We are going to have FCR Law making the presentation. FCR Law is a dynamic Brazilian law firm advising national and international business, entrepreneurs, and investors on almost all aspects of Brazilian law. They provide high-quality services and establish long-term relationships with their clients and partners. Their clients range from tech startups to large international manufacturing business and financial institutions. The agenda today includes a welcome message from our counsel and program manager and the presentation from FCR Law. After that, we are going to have 10 minutes for Q&As, and we expect you to be finishing by 5 p.m. A few housekeeping reminders. Please keep your microphone and camera turned off during the presentation. Questions can be sent through the chat, so we will be answering them on the Q&A session. This webinar is being recorded, so we will have it available. And for those interested or who could not join us today, we will send the link later. Just let us know if you want to receive that. We are also going to provide the contact information for the presenters at the end of the session, so please feel free to reach out to them and send questions that could not be answered in this session. Also, if you are interested in other industries in Brazil, I will be glad to connect you to my other colleagues from the Brazilian Trade Platform. So before we start, I'm going to call our counsel and program manager, Eric Gelinas, to welcome the audience. We were supposed to have Elise Hasiko, who is our senior trade commissioner, but she had a problem with the connection. So I'm inviting Eric to welcome you. Eric, the floor is yours.
Merci, Claudia. Bonjour à tous. On behalf of the Canadian government and the Trade Commissioner Service, I would like to welcome you to this webinar organized in cooperation with representatives of FCR Law. For those of you who are not familiar with the Trade Commissioner Service, we are part of Global Affairs Canada, and we are here to help your company accessing the Brazilian market. We can provide advices on marketing strategies and up-to-date market information to help smooth your company's path to doing business in Brazil. The Trade Commissioner Service has a network of more than 1,000 trade professionals working in 161 cities around the world, but also across Canada. In Brazil, we have offices in Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Recife, Belo Horizonte, and Porto Alegre. We have more than 33 commissioners and assistants who are here to help you. You are more than welcome to use our service. We often tell people that Brazil is not the easiest market, but for companies who persevere, the opportunities are huge. We can prepare your business for the Brazilian market. We can assess your potential for the market, find qualified business contact, and help you resolve a problem you might encounter in the market. And more importantly, our services are free. Today, due to COVID-19 pandemic, Brazilian companies are more open and available to meet virtually. That was not common before the pandemic. The Brazilian tax system is a highly complex one. It is composed of several taxes and taxing entities, a federal government, 27 states, and more than 5,000 municipalities. Not only it is highly complex, but it also imposes a high tax burden and excessive cost for companies doing business in Brazil, which must comply with countless ancillary tax obligations. A new Brazilian proposal for tax reform, which is extremely important for the country's development, is under discussion. These reforms are expected to reduce the tax burden over the business, the environment, and in general. Finally, I would like to encourage you to follow our social media channels where we promote our initiative and our webinar sessions in different sectors. You can find us on Facebook at Canada in Brazil and on Twitter at Canada Brazil. Also, all our trade commissioners, they have their own accounts, so you can contact them. And I think Claudia will give you their information at the end of this seminar. So once again, welcome. And without further ado, I will let Claudia speak.
Thank you, Eric. So I just wanted to give you a brief update on the general situation here in the country. Not sure if you are following the news about Brazil, but we still have a very high number of cases of COVID-19 throughout the country. The latest number shows that we probably reached a plateau and the decrease is expected in the next week. Businesses are going back to the new normal. Shopping centers, stores, and restaurants are opening gradually. And most companies are still working on home-based offices and also gradually planning to return to their corporate offices. The good thing is that we see a change on the mindset of the Brazilian people, Brazilian business people in general. As Eric mentioned, they are more open to engage and meet virtually. Something that was not very common before the pandemic here in Brazil. And we used to say that you really needed to a face-to-face approach in order to engage here with the companies, which is not necessarily true anymore. Hope this change came to stay. And to give you a little bit of context, I've been working on the ICT sector for the past 5 years, and the services related to the information that we are going to present today is one of the most requested services that we provide to our clients. And due to the complexity of this subject, as you will see in this presentation, we are not qualified to provide specific information or advice to our clients, and I always recommend that the companies consult a tax advisor. Last year, we have invited a few law firms to participate on a process to build a guide for this specific subject that could provide some basic information to our clients. And this webinar is part of this project where FCR Law will make a presentation about the document they built to us. Also, this guide is available upon request, so just let me know if you are interested and I can send you a copy of this document. The tax regime for software operations in Brazil is quite complex and challenging to understand, with several tax contributions and tariffs in different levels, and also subject to frequent changes and different interpretations. Therefore, it's very important to be at least familiar with that before you come to a proposal discussion with your prospect here in Brazil. Now, I'm going to call our speakers, FCR Law. FCR Law provides tailored support to Canadian clients establishing or operating in Brazil. Their Canadian desk team does not only speak English and French fluently, but also understands the cultural and legal framework in Canada and have developed a wide network therein. The head of the desk, Philippe Jeffrey, is himself a Canadian lawyer, member of the Quebec Bar. As a former PwC partner, he has accumulated experience on advising multinational companies in their cross-border transactions. He has 20 years of combined tax and management experience in assisting foreign and Brazilian multinational companies with their domestic and cross-border transactions in Brazil, Latin America, Europe, and setup of international tax structure. In addition, Philippe has extensive experience with domestic transactions in Brazil, tax due diligence reviews, as well as tax compliance reviews, transfer pricing, and local trade and customs issues. Eduardo Fleury is a founding partner of FCR Law and head of the firm's tax department. He has broad experience in both public and private sectors, being considered a tax expert not only by his clients, but also by Brazilian tax policymakers, the press, and other organizations, which he constantly advises about tax matters. Fleury has a solid practical experience in the Brazilian tax system. He is a former officer of the São Paulo State Revenue Service and of the Brazilian Federal Revenue Service. These positions allowed him to obtain a pragmatic and detailed approach on state and federal tax matters. His expertise is not restricted to the Brazilian tax legislation, also comprising tax aspects related to cross-border transactions, as well as international tax and the U.S. tax system. Recently, Fleury was nominated as tax consultant for the World Bank in order to support the assessment of the impacts of a potential tax reform on the Brazilian economy. Eduardo and Philippe, thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you very much for presenting today. I will pass over to you, okay?
Okay, Claudia, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, and I think it's too many features for me, but I accept. Good afternoon for everybody, and I would like to thank the Consulate of Canada in São Paulo for inviting us to make a presentation about such important matter as the software taxation in Brazil. I would say that software is always important, but today, in the pandemic that we are going through, it's a very important matter. Our lives is all about softwares, of course. We are working, studying, and even having a social life through softwares. Of course, when I am talking about software, I'm talking about other technologies that are related to softwares. Of course, I would like to give an example. Every month in my law firm, in our law firm, we have a happy hour. Okay, now we have an online happy hour, and so our life today is, of course, it's so important to have software. The Brazilian software industry is very solid, but despite this, as any other country, we need to receive technology and software from other countries. And that's why it's so important now to explain to you about the taxation of software in Brazil. Okay? Please, Claudia, can you go forward with the taxation? Please, you can skip this presentation because we talk a lot of good things about our law firm here in Brazil. Okay, go further. One more slide, please. One more. That's it. Okay. When you are talking about Brazilian taxation system, usually everybody says, "Oh, it's a very complicated system." Yes, it is, but you can manage this system. Please don't give up. Don't give to other people the task to understand this. Try yourself to understand this. Talking about the Brazilian tax system, the first phrase that comes in my head is the devil is in the details. Please don't be satisfied with an answer like, oh, if you are selling software to Brazil, we are going to pay 10, 20, 30%. Don't be satisfied with this answer. The devil is in the details. Be careful. I wouldn't say that sometimes the answer is wrong. What is very important to understand that you can have other models, other business models that can reduce the taxation. You can save tax if you can compare other types of tax models or business models. Okay, and so it's very important to go deep in order to analyze the taxation in Brazil, especially in case of software. Other concepts that I would like to, other advices or concepts that I would like to give to you. First, when you are talking about taxation on services and goods, but especially on services, usually your competitor in Brazil will face the similar taxation. Of course, decided with the exception of the tariffs. But beside that, the taxation is similar. But I am talking about the tax on services, okay? The other advice that I'd like to pass is the following. Don't consider the tax on service alone. You have to analyze together with the corporate tax if you decide to establish a company or a subsidiary in Brazil, or even though if you want only to sell the software to Brazil, you have to consider together with the tax on service, you have to consider also the withholding taxes. Please do make the analysis using tax on services plus withholding tax and corporate taxes, if it is the case. Okay, please, Claudia, can you skip to the next slide? Okay. As Claudia already said, we prepared a kind of tax memo, okay? And there is also a one-page memo, a kind of summary about the taxation. But we strongly advise you guys to go through the tax memo. And what we use in this tax memo or one-page memo, it's a kind of classification that is useful to understand how much tax I will pay when I am selling services, especially software to Brazil. The first classification that we have is a kind of tax classification, okay? And sometimes we can see this same tax classification in international laws, like the interpretation of the tax treaties, okay? But basically, sometimes is a classification that depends, that arises from the Brazilian tax system. The first classification is the off-the-shelf software, which is the software that is ready to be used. The best example that we have in this case is the Office from Microsoft. I just download the software and start using. No problem with that. The software is ready to be used. Games is also the same concept. The other classification is the customized software. As the name is saying, is meaning, the customized software is a tailor-made software. The client asks the company to design a software according to their needs. And so the customized software is much more a service than off-the-shelf software, okay? And the other classification that we usually use in Brazil is the embedded software. Embedded software is the software that comes inside of the device. For example, you have I think the name is Apple Car software. When you buy a car, you have inside the Apple Cars software. You have other softwares in the car. But of course, you buy the car, not the software. That's why, of course, in most of countries, we have the taxation, in this case, not on the software, but of course, the taxation on cars, on devices, and so on. And so in this case, if you can classify your software as in this situation, what you have to understand is the taxation on the merchandise, on the goods, and not the tax not in the taxation on the software. Okay. The other type of classification that we used in our tax memo is the way that we access the software. It's basically we have three ways to access the software. First is via download. So you can download the software, install in your machine, in your computer, and start using the software. The other way to access the software is using the cloud computing, using SAS services, infrastructure services, and PAS services also. And that's the other way to access the service. And in the very old-fashioned way, you have the software in CD. What I am saying that depending how what's the way that you are assessing the software, or the way the tax classification that you have, the taxation can be different, may be vary depending this classification that I just mentioned to you. Please, Claudia, can you skip for them? The other important part of the taxation of the software in Brazil is what I call the perspective, the way that the business model will be implemented if you want to sell softwares, games, and other technologies, related technologies to Brazil. The first option, of course, is a Canadian exporter selling directly to the end user, to the client. Okay, so you have a set of taxes that you have to pay in this case. The other option, of course, is a Canadian exporter selling to a Brazilian distributor that we are going to sell or sub-license to the end user. The Canadian exporter can license to the Brazilian distributor, and the Brazilian distributor can sub-license to the end user. Usually you can say, oh, it's very common to have this kind of structure in other countries. Yes, but in Brazil, the difference is that the taxation will vary too much in these cases, okay? And the third option that we have is very similar to the second one, but the problem is, the difference is the distributor will be a Canadian company with a subsidiary in Brazil, okay? And so the Canadian company will set up a company in Brazil, okay, a subsidiary, and the subsidiary will sell or sub-license to the end user. This option, that's why it's very important to understand the corporate tax if you want to make business in Brazil using a subsidiary. And sometimes it's much better to have a subsidiary in Brazil, okay, in order to sell your services in Brazil. So we advise you to think about this possibility. Please, Claudia, can you move to the fourth? Okay. This table, we can show you just in a, I would say, very short way, the tax that we have to pay, that you have to pay when you are selling to Brazil. Especially, I'd like to show you in the left side of this table, we have exportation of services to Brazil. Okay, what tax you have to pay? Of course, depends so much of the tax classification, but generally you have to pay withholding tax, which is 15%, and you may take credit in the Canadian company. We have a contribution that we call CD. Okay, this contribution is 10%. Okay, and you cannot take credit in Canada. Also, we have a kind of VAT that is charged when you are importing services to Brazil, and the rate is 9.25%. And depending of the activity of the importer, they can take credit of these taxes, okay, of this PIS/COFINS. We expect that our tax reform can eliminate this kind of big mess that we have here. The other tax that is very important to consider if you want to export services to Brazil is the tax on services, ISS. This tax is charged by the municipality, so the rate can vary from 2 to 5%. Okay, and just a reminder, the PIS/COFINS is a federal taxes. Okay, ISS is a municipal tax, local taxes, and you have the tax on financial operations, which is EOF. In this case, when you are converting Brazilian currency to Canadian dollars, you have to pay 0.38%. Okay, on the amount that you are converting to. Okay, it's important also to understand that despite all the taxes that we are showing in this table, the responsibility to collect these taxes is the client, not the Canadian company. Okay, so if you are selling to Brazil, the responsible to pay these taxes, the responsibility is of the client in Brazil. Okay, Claudia, please, can you move to the next slide? Now, this is the tax that you have to pay in the perspective of corporation. Okay, if you decide to establish a company in Brazil, these are the tax that you have to pay. First, the first line and the second line, you have the corporate taxes. In a summary, the rate is 34% that you have to consider, 34% on the profits. Okay. After that, we have the same PIS/COFINS that I mentioned in the last slide, but this PIS/COFINS is not upon the importation, but it is when you sell to the client, you have to pay the PIS/COFINS, and you can take credit of what you paid in the importation. Okay, there is two systems. One, you pay 9.25% as a rate, but you can take credit. And there is another tax regime where you pay 3.65%, but you cannot take credits. We have also IPI, which doesn't matter so much for us in this presentation because it is charged only on importation of goods, okay, and when you are selling goods. But the other tax that is very important today is ICMS. It's levied by the states, okay? And you say, but they only charge ICMS on goods when you are selling goods. However, in a recent interpretation that changed so much the things in the taxation of software in Brazil, the state governments, they make the interpretation saying that software is a kind of digital goods. And so they start charging ICMS using a 5% rate on this upon the sale of softwares. And so Philippe will explain a little bit this situation right now in Brazil, but in the past we didn't pay ICMS. Right now, from 2018 to now, we have to pay ICMS in a base of 5% upon the sale of software in Brazil. And also, as I explained before, you have to pay ISS, okay, it's a tax on service levied by the local government, by the municipalities. Okay, now Philippe, that is going to make the presentation of the other part of this webinar, and he is going to explain in giving examples, analyzing some business model, and giving the right tax burden that you have to pay in every situation. Okay, please, Philippe, it's in your hands right now. And thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Eduardo. I would like to thank the consulate of Canada in São Paulo, Claudia and her teams for inviting us to be with you guys this afternoon. I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon. Bon après-midi à tout le monde qui nous écoute présentement. Obviously, normally, Eduardo and I, we are in Canada physically in front of you to do those kinds of presentations. I would say that I much rather to be there physically and to be able to discuss with you. Just wait, people. Can you see me, Claudia?
No, I cannot see you, Philippe. Oh, now it's better. Yeah.
No, that's good.
I can see you. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I was saying, like, I much rather normally to be like physically in Canada to be able to do those kind of presentations. But I'm looking on the right sides also of those things. And now I see that we have over like 43 participants listening to the presentation. So often wise, it's difficult when we're there physically to gather like that much people, like to make everyone to come to see us. Like Eduardo was mentioning, we'll kind of, now that you are a specialist and you fully understand the 15 taxes that Eduardo just explained to you, we will try to put this into perspective to see how it would apply. But I would also would like to take the opportunity, like Eric mentioned at the beginning of the introductions, about the complexity of the system in Brazil. Like, this is well known by everyone that Brazil is not an easy market from a tax perspective. Things are difficult. But also, one thing that is important to understand is that the amount of opportunities in the market. So this is something that needs to be put into perspective, like the opportunities that Brazilian and Canadian software companies got in Brazil versus the complexity of doing business. And I think once you have good advisors locally to help you to go through all the difficulties, what remains is the big opportunities of doing business. And obviously for software company, like Eduardo was mentioning during the current crisis, this is something that we already see like a good opportunity for software company who wants to explore the Brazilian market. So Claudia, if you want maybe to go to the following slides. One more. Well, this one, I think Eduardo kind of covered this, but I would like to get back a little bit about it. Is that first we need to understand what type of software that you are selling, off the shelf, customized, embedded software, and also how you are distributing the software in Brazil. Is that via download? Something that we're starting to see a little bit less. A couple of years ago, it was quite frequent to purchase software through downloads. Now what we can see on a much frequent basis, or to make available the software through cloud computing. Because once we understand this, Eduardo was mentioning the taxations on those type of transactions will change, but not also this part, because you will see in the following slides, you will easily understand, at least if it's something that you will understand today. This is not too difficult to understand. It is, from a tax perspective, it is much more expensive to sell services to Brazil than licensing a software. So the taxes that apply on software license are a little bit lower than the taxes that apply on supply of services. So when we talk with companies that works on the SaaS model, as an example, where the package that is sold to the clients will include different items like the supply of services, like the licensing of softwares, and so on. So this is important also when you take the decision, how am I going to invoice my product to the Brazilian client? Because outside of Brazil, frequently you will do a simple invoice and you will charge like a SaaS fee for the client to access and receive the services. In Brazil, we might want to think, so you might want to think to invoice your product differently, not by creating transactions that do not exist, but if we are able to segregate what is charged as a license for the software and what is charged on services, as an example, it might give you a better tax result. But let's go to the following slides and we can maybe see something, how this would work. So the first example that we're showing here is the simplest model that we can see. So a Canadian company does not have any presence in Brazil, does not use a distributor in Brazil, and the Canadian company is selling directly to a Brazilian end user. So what kind of taxation will apply? And here we'll see a little bit afterwards when we talk about the SaaS, but here I'm looking at a transaction, a pure software license that is granted to the end user. So the taxation that will apply on this will be the 15% withholding tax. There will be a municipal service tax that will apply also on the transactions between 2 to 5%, depending on where you are selling in the country. ICMS, I will kind of skip my comments regarding ICMS because Eduardo has touched base a little bit about the issues of the ICMS, but I will get back a little bit later on my presentation about the ICMS, the state VAT. And the last one is IOF. IOF is a financial tax in Brazil that apply in the example that I'm showing to you guys that applies on the foreign exchange transaction. So when the client goes at the bank and make the money transfer to you guys, the bank will charge him a fee of 0.38% on the amount of money that is wired back to you guys in Canada. So now let's go to the second model. Thank you, Claudia. The second model is showing you a transaction where the Canadian company will decide to hire a Brazilian distributor, not only potentially to resell the software to the end user, but also to perform other tasks in Brazil, like marketing, going after clients, and so on. So often-wise, Canadian company do not want at the beginning to open its own company in Brazil, but will want to sell the software through a distributor that will also provide other type of services to the Canadian company. So if I look on the left side of the table, this is exactly the same taxation that we just mentioned regarding the licensing of your software. So you will grant a license of commercialization to the Brazilian distributor. So the same taxation will apply. And then when the Brazilian distributor will resell your software to the end user, then the distributor will be subject to taxation. So the federal contribution, PIS/COFINS that Eduardo mentioned, the municipal service tax, and also the controversial ICMS that might apply on the transaction. So very easily, if you take a look at the slides and you take a look at the previous slides, obviously you will have as a first comments, why would I want to have a Brazilian distributor in Brazil? Because now I can see that I would first pay the same taxation that if I license my software directly to the end user. But in addition, I will create a second level of taxation when the distributor will be selling to the end user. Well, there's not like right and wrong answer to this. It depends on the case. First, like I mentioned, maybe you need someone in Brazil that will provide other services to you. So you need someone to be able to act as a distributor of your product. But also, then we will get to the second models, the third models afterwards. It is depending on who are your clients in Brazil. We often see clients saying to Canadian companies, well, I am very interested to purchase your product, to purchase your software, but I am not interested to make a payment directly to a Canadian company. So I'm interested by your software, but I'm interested to acquire your software from a Brazilian company. And why would they say this? It's because if they send the money directly to the Canadian company, they are responsible to withhold all the taxes that we are mentioning on the table here. So the end user end up by having tax obligations on the payments that we'll be making to the Canadian company. The other thing too, often-wise, depending on the size of your clients, they might not have, let's say, the sophistication necessarily to deal with a foreign transaction. So those are the case first that you might be, I wouldn't say forced, but let's say like strongly encouraged to sell your product in Brazil through a distributor or through your own Brazilian company in Brazil. Because often wise again, you will not be able to reach the objective that you want. And again, obviously, you would have a second layer of taxation on the transaction, but it also depends on your bargaining power that you have on the transaction. So if you are selling a software that is not existing in the country, so you have much more margin to have potentially a product that will cost a little bit more to the end user because you're creating different level of taxation. But again, depending of this bargaining power, it might not in itself be a problem. Okay, Claudia, next slide, please. Now we're getting to something that we see quite frequently at the office, or companies selling their software under the SaaS models. So they're not only licensing software, but they are selling a package to the end user to access the platform, to be able to use the software, for them to have a software that is constantly updated. So it's really a package that includes services, that include licensing of the software. From a Brazilian tax perspective, we still have just a few decisions because obviously this model, it is still quite recent in the market in Brazil. But the last tax decision that we had from the tax authorities in Brazil, the tax authorities have taken the position that the entire package is seen and should be characterized from a tax perspective as a supply of technical services. Then what I was mentioning to you guys when I started my presentations, the taxation on services is much higher than the taxation on licensing or software. So if I look at the table here, those are again the same taxes that I just mentioned to you guys, but you will see that two other taxes have been added to this table, which are the second one, the CG, 10%, and the PIS and COFINS at 9.25%. So if I compare the taxation again regarding services and licensing, to make a very quick and dirty calculation here, we're pretty much talking about like an additional 20% of taxation on the transaction. Obviously, PIS and COFINS in some cases can be creditable. It depends of how the transaction is organized. But CG, the 10% CG as an example, is not a creditable tax. So it becomes a cost on the transaction. So what I was mentioning, this is when and how it is important to see how you're selling your software. And then with the help of professionals in Brazil, of ourselves, Eduardo and I, to see with you if we can try to segregate the operations, to try to allocate a portion of what you're invoicing to your client as a licensing of software, and another portion of what is invoiced as services. Because in this case, we might potentially get to a better tax burden for the sales of your product in Brazil. Okay. So next slide, please. So again, this is the same models that we've been showing you by creating an additional level of taxation by having a transaction by either using a Brazilian distributor or either having your Canadian company having a Brazilian subsidiary in Brazil. One question that we also hear frequently, I think I touched base a little bit on this, but just to make sure that it is clear, is that if you are selling as a Canadian company your product directly to a Brazilian distributor or to the end user, all the tax obligations that we're looking at them here are on the hand of the Brazilian distributor or the client, the end user in Brazil. You as a Canadian company do not have tax obligation in Brazil. So who will need to withhold those taxes and remit the money to the tax authorities will be either the Brazilian distributor or either the end user. But then if you decide, you say, no, I want to have a little bit more control. I need to have a presence in Brazil, and I want to have more control of what's happening. So I want to make the decision to open my own company in Brazil. In this case, obviously, your Brazilian subsidiary will become responsible for all those tax obligations here. Next slide, please. Now we get to these very interesting issues. regarding the fight between the tax authorities in Brazil. I think Eduardo mentioned this quickly, but in Brazil, we have 3 levels of taxation. We have the federal level, we have the state level, and we have the municipal level. And all of them have their own VAT or tax on services and so on. So it's a little bit like in Canada where you have the provincial tax and the federal taxes. But here in Brazil, it's a little bit more complex because the numbers of taxes, as you can see in the table that we've been showing you, is important. And there's also fight between the different taxing levels regarding if I have the right or not to tax the transactions. If I go back when I arrived in Brazil 20 years ago, and we were talking about like taxation on software, it was a little bit more, it was a little bit easier to see that a software that was sold locally could be characterized as a good, and as such, being subject to the state VAT, the ICMS. Because at that time, you had to go to a store, you were buying like a box that included a disc or a CD. So you were in fact acquiring a physical media of something. And it was at that time easier to understand that in such case, the ICMS should apply. Because again, the main difference between the ICMS and the ISS is that ISS applies on services and the ICMS applies on goods, except few exceptions in the case of ICMS, like energy and telecommunication, that might be. But let's say, like, to simplify this, services are subject to the ISS, which is a municipal tax, and the ICMS is applicable on goods, which is a state VAT. What happens after that is that once the models of selling software started to change, the ICMS authorities, at least in Sao Paulo, took an approach by saying, okay, listen, I'm not going to tax you the value of licensing your software, but I'm going to tax you on the price or the cost of the CDs or the disc. So I will charge you ICMS on the goods that I can see here, which is the cost of the CDs or the disc at that time. And prior that we changed the rule of the ICMS, in Sao Paulo, as an example, they were charging the ICMS on twice the value of the physical media. Sorry. What happened, like Eduardo was mentioning, is that obviously now no one is selling software through CDs or through disc and so on. So obviously, prior to a change of the legislation or a change of interpretation, it was very difficult to have a software transaction subject to ICMS. What has changed since 2018, like Eduardo was mentioning, is that the state tax authority said, if you're selling like off-the-shelf software, there's no customization of that. And again, something that is important, if you are selling directly to the end user, I understand the state VAT, the tax authorities, that transaction could be subject to the ICMS as a digital good. It's not that easy because, again, the legislation was not fully changed. So I think the message that we want to pass, not to make things too complicated, is that if you are selling a software directly to the end user, either through a distributor or either from you guys in Canada directly to the end user, you might have an ICMS problems. And why we say it's a problem, because on the perfect world in Brazil, if a transaction is subject to ISS, the municipal service tax, it is not subject to ICMS and vice versa. But now, the way that it is right now, you might sell your product where the state authorities will say, you need to pay ICMS on this. And at the same time, I think the municipal state authorities saying that I have also the right to charge you the tax on this. So this is something that we need to be aware of. To give you like a very quick example, a lot of our clients that are selling software, we have entered for them at the justice level to contest the application of the ICMS on those transactions. For pretty much a lot of our clients, we managed to get a positive result from the court, where the court issue an order that the ICMS should not be charged on that transaction. But this is something that will need to be monitored. And then like we shortly touched base, Brazil is currently going through like an important tax reform. So we hope that once the tax reform is implemented, we stop having those type of fight between the different taxing level and authorities in Brazil. So the last slides now. This last slide, I just wanted to touch base a little bit with you guys on questions that we receive frequently from you. First, saying that we know that there's a tax treaty between Brazil and Canada. Does it help? To give you a simple answer, from a Brazilian perspective, the answer is no. It doesn't help in the sense that it will not reduce the taxation that we just mentioned to you when someone in Brazil will be paying you to Canada, because the 15% first, the only taxes that could be that can be reduced by the tax treaty will be the withholding tax, the 15% withholding tax. And the Canada-Brazil tax treaty does not reduce further this 15%. All the other taxes that we mentioned to you, the CG, the municipal service tax, and all of those taxes are not covered by the tax treaty, so they do not have any effect. The only potential benefit that you may have from the tax treaty is that the treaty says that if someone in Brazil pays a royalties to a Canadian companies, even if the withholding tax in Brazil is 15%, Revenue Canada can be able to give you a credit of 20%. Basically, they give you a foreign tax credit for an amount, for a percentage 5% higher than the actual tax. So this is obviously something that you need to discuss with your Canadian tax advisors. But the tax treaty would allow Canada to grant you a 20% tax credit instead of 15%. The other things regarding international treaty, I think a lot of you are aware that Canada is currently under negotiation with Mercosur to have a free trade agreement. This is also often a question that we receive, saying, okay, but once we have the free trade agreement in place, it is still under negotiation, it's not in place yet, is that something that will help me? If we're looking at software, this is not something that the free trade agreement will help, because the free trade agreements normally, when we will look at the reduction of taxation, would apply on goods, on merchandise that is sold between the two countries. So normally, we still need to see how the final version of the free trade agreement will be. But as a general rules on software transaction, we will not be expecting, again, a reduction of taxation. The two last points regarding regulatory, we also frequently receive questions, do I need to register my software in Brazil with the Intellectual Property Agency? If you're not transferring the technology, which normally in the case of software, we're talking about to transfer the source code of the software to someone, the answer is no. You do not have the obligations to register your software with the what we call in Brazil the INPI, which is the National Institute of Intellectual Property. The last things, which is something also important to mention, is that Brazil is currently updating its general data protection law. This new law was supposed to enter into force this month, in August of 2020. But now, because of the COVID-19 crisis, there's a law that is trying to extend the application of the new law until May of 2021. So for the time being, the new law is not in force. And I say we are expecting, because the way that this law, what we call a provisional measure in Brazil, has got a life expectancy of normally like 60 days, while the authorities need to convert this law, this provisional measure into law. But if everything goes good, this new law should apply only in May 2021. But the point is that if as part of what you're selling includes the processing of personal data, you will need to take a look at this new law and see how you will need to be in compliance with that. So from my part, that was it, Claudia. I think this is what I had to share with you today.
Thank you very much, Philippe. That was very comprehensive and a good explanation or presentation about everything. I know that the subject is not easy, and I hope not to scare our audience, our exporters with that. If anyone, I think we didn't receive any questions. I think either we scared the people, or it was so clear that nobody has any questions. But I have a question myself. When, for example, we are talking to the Canadian companies, we always tell them that they should be aware of the system here, of how taxation is done here in Brazil, because I think it's common to see companies presenting or starting to negotiate proposals before knowing all the local conditions here. And this is something that they may regret later, right? What's your advice on how should Canadian companies should present or think about making their pricing proposal when dealing with the Brazilian companies?
Yeah, this is something very important, Claudia, that you are mentioning here, because when we talk about the complexity of Brazil and so on, this is part of it. So we have seen, not a lot, but we still see once in a while companies that are already selling their software to Brazil, okay? And when they realize, when they take a look at the money that they receive in Canada, they don't understand, because they invoice their software for 100, but they receive in Canada like $40, $50, and they say, where's the money? Well, the money was withheld to pay the tax authority. So this is key. When prior to selling your software in Brazil, you need first to understand by yourself or with the help of professionals what kind of taxation we will talk about, and also to make some simulations, because and obviously all the taxes that both Eduardo and I have been mentioning, all of this can be negotiated between the parties. So you can say, I want to receive 100, so you will need to invoice an amount higher than 100 to receive 100. But this is obviously something that is quite important, because this is also will be the difference between a company that's got success in Brazil and another one that's got that becomes a disaster. So to make sure that proper simulation are done to also preserve the margin of the transaction, because you might end up with a transaction that you don't have any longer any margin on it, or that even potentially puts you in a loss position. Eduardo, I don't know if you have another.
No, I think that's it. But I think there are more questions.
Yes.
Chat we have.
Thank you very much. Yes, exactly. As you mentioned, I've seen this before, and that's why it's very important to think about this thing. So we have a question here. Your presentation covered tax implications of temporary license. What is the difference for perpetual license?
Yeah. It might be the same, but it might not be the same. So it depends a little bit. And now we go back to the potential issue with the ICMS and the ISS that we need to see. So it might not change the taxation, but it might. I guess it depends a little bit of what, in addition of the permanent license, is sold to the client to be able to see. But it might, yes, have a difference in the applicable taxation.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. In the case of establishing a subsidiary in Brazil for selling services, when bringing money to Canada, what would be the taxes on selling by this subsidiary, and then when wiring the money as profit, or just transferring the money?
Yeah, but for the time being, pretty much the only thing that is not taxation in Brazil are the payments of dividends. So a Brazilian company that pays dividends to a Canadian companies, the dividend payments will not be subject to taxation in Brazil. This is, I'm saying for the time being, okay, as part of the tax reform, what it's been discussing is potentially the payments of dividends will become subject to taxation in Brazil. But right now, obviously the best way for a Brazilian company to repatriate money back to Canada will be through the payment of dividends, to not to have additional taxation on the transaction. But it depends, because if first the Canadian company is selling its services to the Brazilian company, well, the Brazilian company will need to pay also a service fee to the Canadian companies, and then a portion, that service fee will be subject to the taxation. So this is also part of doing the modeling a little bit of the transaction, of how the money will be repatriated back to Canada under the best tax efficient model.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, is there anything we should be careful of in quoting software in Brazil? For example, we are careful to sell physical goods as ex-works or FOB to ensure we don't incur tax by accident.
Now, regarding software and services, it's a little bit different. So, because obviously, when you're selling goods to Brazil, the calculation basis of the taxes applies depending on if you sell FOB, CIF, and so on. So this will have an impact. But in the case of services and software, the tax applies on whatever is invoiced for. So you're selling 100, the taxes will be calculated on 100.
Okay.
But I think the other thing that's important to mention is what Philippe said before. It's about the agreement that we have with the Brazilian company. When you're selling to a Brazilian company, we have to understand who will be responsible. Before the law, of course, the Brazilian company will be responsible to collect tax, but who is going to support the tax, of course. So as Philippe said, how much will be the tax invoice? $100 or $150? How much money we want to receive in Canada? That's a very important question, and you have to solve this with a good, at least a good agreement with the client.
Okay, great. So I think it's our last question here. So when creating the invoice to send to client, should we do the breakdown of tax on invoice? In the past, we have made a note on invoice. Invoice amount is net of all taxes, as this is the amount agreed during contract.
Now, the invoice that will be coming from Canada will not be making the breakdown of the Brazilian taxes on the transaction. So what we were mentioning is that when a simulation needs to be made that will include all the taxes on the transactions. And then, like Eduardo was just mentioning, maybe I need to invoice 150 to receive 100, because half of what, or 33% of what I'm invoicing will be the taxes on the transactions. The Canadian company will only issue its invoice of 100, and then the Brazilian company that will be making the payments will be making the calculation of the taxes. But the Canadian company do not need to provide like an invoice that will be showing all of those taxes. But again, the taxes are part of the negotiation with the clients in Brazil.
Okay, great.
I don't know if it's, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so that was our last question. Thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of this webinar. I really appreciate your participation and interest in watching this session, and hoping that you find the information presented useful. And despite of its complexity, we will also encourage your company to invest some time and explore the opportunities here in the Brazilian market. Also, I want to thank FCR Law, Eduardo, Philippe, and their team for presenting here today, for the great quality of information, and that I'm sure will help our Canadian clients. As a reminder, we are available to have more in-depth conversations, so please contact us to find out more about this market. Thank you very much. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Claudia. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, Claudia. Okay. Turn.